All righty. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the witnesses are here. I'm sorry, I have to end the hearing. I have a plane that I cannot miss. And I just want to wrap up by adding the following statements into the record. From Mike Ritz, former U.S. military interrogator. From Peter Shane, a professor at Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. From Colonel Steve Kleinman, U.S. Air Force Reserve, a professional interrogator. From Matthew Alexander, a professional interrogator in the U.S. Air Force Reserve and author of How to Break a Terrorist. From Elisa Massimino of Human Rights First. The Senate Armed Services Committee report, I think I already put into the record. And the testimony of Michael Stokes Paulson. I'd like to close with the words of Matthew Alexander from his statement. As an interrogator in Iraq, I conducted more than 300 interrogations and supervised more than 1,000. I led the interrogations team that located Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the former leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq and one of the most notorious mass murderers of our generation. At the time that we killed Zarqawi, he was the #1 priority for the United States military, higher than Osama bin Laden. I strongly oppose the use of torture or abuse as interrogation methods for both pragmatic and moral reasons. There are many pragmatic reasons against torture and abuse. The first is the lack of evidence that torture or abuse as an interrogation tactic is faster or more efficient than other methods. In my experience, when interrogators use harsh methods that fit the definition of abuse, in every instance, that method served only to harden the resolve of the detainee and made them more resistant to interrogation. The second pragmatic argument against torture and abuse is the fact that al-Qaeda used our policy that authorized and encouraged these illegal methods as their #1 recruiting tool for foreign fighters. While I supervised interrogations in Iraq, I listened to a majority of foreign fighters state that the reason they'd come to Iraq to fight was because of the torture and abuse committed at both Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. These foreign fighters made up approximately 90% of the suicide bombers in Iraq at that time. In addition to leading and participating in thousands of attacks against coalition and Iraqi forces, it is not an exaggeration to say that hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers died at the hands of these foreign fighters. The policy that authorized and encouraged the torture and abuse of prisoners has cost us American lives. I deployed to the war with 4 other Air Force special agents with experience as criminal investigators. We brought with us skills and training that were unique compared to our Army counterparts. We learned to interrogate criminal suspects using relationship building and non-coercive police investigative techniques. I learned quickly that al-Qaeda has much more in common with criminal organizations than with traditional rank-and-file soldiers. I used techniques permitted by the Army manual under the terms psychological ploys, verbal trickery, or other nonviolent or non-coercive subterfuge to great success, and I taught these techniques to other members of my interrogation team. I also want to address the so-called ticking time bomb scenario that is so often used as an excuse for torture and abuse. My team lived through this scenario every day in Iraq. The men that we captured and interrogated were behind Zarqawi's suicide bombing campaign. Most of our prisoners had knowledge of future suicide bombing operations that could have been prevented with a quick extraction of accurate intelligence information. What works best in the ticking time bomb scenario is relationship building, which is not a time-consuming effort when conducted by a properly trained interrogator, and non-coercive deception. Contrary to popular belief, building a relationship with a prisoner is not necessarily a time-consuming exercise. I conducted point-of-capture interrogations in Iraqi homes, streets, and cars, and I discovered that in these time-constrained environments where an interrogator has 10 or 15 minutes to assess a detainee and obtain accurate intelligence information, relationship building and deception were again the most effective interrogation tools. It is about being smarter, not being harsher. When I took the oath of office as a military officer, I swore to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, which specifically prohibits cruelty towards any person in the 8th Amendment. In addition, torture and abuse are inconsistent with the basic principles of freedom, liberty, and justice upon which our country was founded. George Washington, during the Revolutionary War, specifically prohibited his troops from torturing prisoners. Abraham Lincoln prohibited Union troops from torturing Confederate prisoners. We have a long history of abiding by American principles while conducting war. I can offer no better words than those of General George C. Marshall, the orchestrator of the Allied victory in Europe during World War II, who stated, "Once an army is involved in war, there is a beast in every fighting man which begins tugging at its chains. A good officer must learn early on how to keep the beast under control, both in his men and in himself. We are smart enough to effectively interrogate our adversaries, and we should not doubt our ability to convince our detainees to cooperate. American culture gives us unique advantages that we can leverage during interrogations. Tolerance, cultural understanding, intellect, and ingenuity. In closing, the same qualities that make us great Americans will make us great interrogators. I think I had planned longer remarks, but given the hour, I think I'll conclude with those words, which are very helpful. And I would add for the record pages from a book called Camp 020, describing the techniques employed by British military intelligence when the Nazi threat loomed over their country, presumably a threat at least equal to the threat of al-Qaeda to our country, and their findings, among other things, that violence in interrogations is appropriate. For one thing, it is the act of a coward. For another, it is unintelligent.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe we'll end this hearing with some agreement. If we're talking about, do I agree with what was it the lieutenant that you read? The state?
Alexander.
Yeah. I mean, I generally agree with that. I've been a military lawyer all my life. I believe in the Geneva Convention. I believe that the moment we capture somebody, the obligation falls upon us to abide by the convention. And if you don't want to live by the convention, get out of it. Now, there's people who have a different view. There's people, quite frankly, Mr. Zufan, that if we called as witnesses, would probably graphically describe what they did, and that information they received gave us knowledge about the enemy we wouldn't have had otherwise.
I'm terribly sorry to have to
Can
do
I
this.
talk?
But yes.
Okay.
But what I would like to do is to close the hearing at the conclusion of Senator Graham's remarks.
Right.
There is a week to add any testimony that anybody wishes. I cannot miss this point.
Gotcha.
I apologize very much. You have the floor, and at the conclusion of your remarks,
Thank you. They won't be long.
Hearing is over.
Go to the airport. And you'll get screened, but that's good.